Chapter 5 A Full-fledged Schoolma'am. When Anne reached the school that morning, for the first time in her life she had traversed the birch path deaf and blind to its beauties. All was quiet and still. The preceding teacher had trained the children to be in their places at her arrival, and when Anne entered the schoolroom, she was confronted by prim rows of shining morning faces and bright, inquisitive eyes. She hung up her hat and faced her pupils, hoping that she did not look as frightened and foolish as she felt, and that they would not perceive how she was trembling. She had sat up until nearly 12 the preceding night, composing a speech she meant to make to her pupils upon opening the school. She had revised and improved it painstakingly, and then she had learned it off by heart. It was a very good speech, and had some very fine ideas in it, especially about mutual help and earnest striving after knowledge. The only trouble was that she could not now remember a word of it. After what seemed to her a year, about 10 seconds in reality, she said faintly, "Take your testaments, please," and sank breathlessly into her chair under cover of the rustle and clatter of desk lids that followed. While the children read their verses, Anne marshalled her shaky wits into order and looked over the array of little pilgrims to the grown-up land. Most of them were, of course, quite well known to her. Her own classmates had passed out in the preceding year, but the rest had all gone to school with her, excepting the primer class and 10 newcomers to Avonlea. Anne secretly felt more interest in these 10 than in those whose possibilities were already fairly well mapped out to her. To be sure, they might be just as commonplace as the rest, but on the other hand, there might be a genius among them. It was a thrilling idea. Sitting by himself at a corner desk was Anthony Pye. He had a dark, sullen little face, and was staring at Anne with a hostile expression in his black eyes. Anne instantly made up her mind that she would win that boy's affection and discomfit the Pyes utterly. In the other corner, another strange boy was sitting with Artie Sloane, a jolly-looking little chap with a snub nose, freckled face, and big light blue eyes, probably the Donald boy. And if resemblance went for anything, his sister was sitting across the aisle with Mary Bell. Anne wondered what sort of mother the child had to send her to school dressed as she was. She wore a faded pink silk dress, trimmed with a great deal of cotton lace, soiled white kid slippers, and silk stockings. Her sandy hair was tortured into innumerable kinky and unnatural curls, surmounted by a flamboyant bow of pink ribbon bigger than her head. Judging from her expression, she was very well satisfied with herself. A pale little thing, with smooth ripples of fine, silky, fawn-colored hair flowing over her shoulders, must, Anne thought, be Annetta Bell, whose parents had formerly lived in the New Bridge School district, but by reason of hauling their house 50 yards north of its old site were now in Avonlea. 3 pallid little girls, crowded into one seat, were certainly Cottons, and there was no doubt that the smaller beauty with the long brown curls and hazel eyes, who was casting coquettish looks at Jack Gills over the edge of her testament, was Prillie Rogerson, whose father had recently married a second wife and brought Prillie home from her grandmother's in Grafton. A tall, awkward girl in a back seat, who seemed to have too many feet and hands. Anne could not place at all, but later on discovered that her name was Barbara Shore, and that she had come to live with an Avonlea aunt. She was also to find that if Barbara ever managed to walk down the aisle without falling over her own or somebody else's feet, the Avonlea scholars wrote the unusual fact up on the porch wall to commemorate it. But when Anne's eyes met those of the boy at the front desk facing her own, a queer little thrill went over her as if she had found her genius. She knew this must be Paul Irving, and that Mrs. Rachel Lynde had been right for once when she prophesied that he would be unlike the Avonlea children. More than that, Anne realized that he was unlike other children anywhere, and that there was a soul subtly akin to her own gazing at her out of the very dark blue eyes that were watching her so intently. She knew Paul was 10, but he looked no more than 8. He had the most beautiful little face she had ever seen in a child, features of exquisite delicacy and refinement, framed in a halo of chestnut curls. His mouth was delicious, being full without pouting, the crimson lips just softly touching and curving into finely finished little corners that narrowly escaped being dimpled. He had a sober, grave, meditative expression, as if his spirit was much older than his body. But when Anne smiled softly at him, it vanished in a sudden answering smile, which seemed an illumination of his whole being, as if some lamp had suddenly kindled into flame inside of him, irradiating him from top to toe. Best of all, it was involuntary, born of no external effort or motive, but simply the outflashing of a hidden personality, rare and fine and sweet. With a quick interchange of smiles, Anne and Paul were fast friends forever before a word had passed between them. The day went by like a dream. Anne could never clearly recall it afterwards. It almost seems as if it were not she who was teaching, but somebody else. She heard classes and worked sums and set copies mechanically. The children behaved quite well. Only 2 cases of discipline occurred. Morley Andrews was caught driving a pair of trained crickets in the aisle. Anne stood Morley on the platform for an hour and, which Morley felt much more keenly, confiscated his crickets. She put them in a box and on the way from school set them free in Violet Vale. But Morley believed, then and ever afterwards, that she took them home and kept them for her own amusement. The other culprit was Anthony Pye, who poured the last drops of water from his sleek bottle down the back of Aurelia Quay's neck. Anne kept Anthony in at recess and talked to him about what was expected of a gentleman, admonishing him that they never poured water down ladies' necks. She wanted all her boys to be gentlemen, she said. Her little lecture was quite kind and touching, but unfortunately Anthony remained absolutely untouched. He listened to her in silence, with the same sullen expression, and whistled scornfully as he went out. Anne sighed, and then cheered herself up by remembering that winning a Pye's affections, like the building of Rome, wasn't the work of a day. In fact, it was doubtful whether some of the Pyes had any affections to win, but Anne hoped better things of Anthony, who looked as if he might be a rather nice boy if one ever got behind his sullenness. When school was dismissed and the children had gone, Anne dropped wearily into her chair. Her head ached, and she felt woefully discouraged. There was no real reason for discouragement, since nothing very dreadful had occurred, but Anne was very tired, and inclined to believe that she would never learn to like teaching, and how terrible it would be to be doing something she didn't like every day for, well, say, 40 years. Anne was of 2 minds, whether to have her cry out then and there, or wait till she was safely in her own white room at home. Before she could decide, there was the click of heels and a silken swish on the porch floor, and Anne found herself confronted by a lady whose appearance made her recall a recent criticism of Mr. Harrison's on an overdressed female he had seen in the Charlottetown store. She looked like a head-on collision between a fashion plate and a nightmare. The newcomer was gorgeously arrayed in the pale blue summer silk, puffed, frilled, and shirred wherever puff, frill, or shirring could possibly be placed. Her head was surmounted by a huge white chiffon hat bedecked with 3 long but rather stringy ostrich feathers. A veil of pink chiffon, lavishly sprinkled with huge black dots, hung like a flounce from the hat brim to her shoulders and floated off in 2 airy streamers behind her. She wore all the jewelry that could be crowded on one small woman, and a very strong odor of perfume attended her. "I am Mrs. Donnell, Mrs. H.B. Donnell," announced his vision, "and I have come in to see you about something Clarice Almira told me when she came home to dinner today. It annoyed me excessively." "I'm sorry?" faltered Anne, vainly trying to recollect any incident of the morning connected with the Donnell children. "Clarice Almira told me that you pronounce our name Donnell. Now, Miss Shirley, the correct pronunciation of her name is Donnell, accent on the last syllable. I hope you remember this in future." "I'll try to," gasped Anne, choking back a wild desire to laugh. "I know by experience that it's very unpleasant to have one's name spelled wrong, and I suppose it must be even worse to have it pronounced wrong." "Certainly it is, and Clarice Almira also informed me that you call my son Jacob." "He told me his name was Jacob." "I might have expected that," said Mrs. H.B. Donnell, in a tone which implied that gratitude in children was not to be looked for in this degenerate age. "That boy has such plebeian taste, Miss Shirley. When he was born I wanted to call him St. Clair. It sounds so aristocratic, doesn't it? But his father insisted he should be called Jacob after his uncle. I yielded because Uncle Jacob was a rich old bachelor, and what do you think, Miss Shirley? When our innocent boy was 5 years old, Uncle Jacob actually went and got married, and now he has 3 boys of his own. Did you ever hear of such ingratitude? The moment the invitation to the wedding, for he had the impertinence to send us an invitation, Miss Shirley, came to the house, I said, 'No more Jacobs for me, thank you.' From that day I called my son St. Clair, and St. Clair I am determined he shall be called. His father obstinately continues to call him Jacob, and the boy himself has a perfectly unaccountable preference for the vulgar name, but St. Clair he is, and St. Clair he shall remain. You will kindly remember this, Miss Shirley, will you not?" "Thank you. I told Clarice Almira that I was sure it was only a misunderstanding, that a word would set it right. Donnell, accent on the last syllable, and St. Clair. On no account Jacob, you remember. Thank you." When Mrs. H.B. Donnell had skimmed away, Anne locked the school door and went home. At the foot of the hill she found Paul Irving by the birch path. He held out to her a cluster of the dainty little wild orchids which Avonlea children called rice lilies. "Please, teacher, I found these in Mr. Wright's field," he said shyly, "and I came back to give them to you because I thought you were the kind of lady that would like them, and because—" He lifted his big, beautiful eyes. "I like you, teacher." "You darling," said Anne, taking the fragrant spikes, as if Paul's words had been a spell of magic. Discouragement and weariness passed from her spirit, and hope upwelled in her heart like a dancing fountain. She went through the birch path light-footedly, attended by the sweetness of her orchids as by a benediction. "Well, how did you get along?" Marilla wanted to know. "Ask me that a month later and I may be able to tell you. I can't now. I don't know myself. I'm too near it. My thoughts feel as if they had been all stirred up until they were thick and muddy." Mrs. Lynde came up later on with more encouragement. That good lady had waylaid the school children at her gate and demanded of them how they liked their new teacher. "And every one of them said they liked you splendid, Anne, except Anthony Pye. I must admit he didn't. He said you weren't any good, just like old girl teachers. There's the pie leaving for you, but never mind."
"I'm not going to mind," said Anne quietly, "and I'm going to make Anthony Pye like me yet. Patience and kindness will surely win him."
"Well, you can never tell about a pie," said Mrs. Rachel cautiously. "They go by contraries, like dreams, often as not. As for that Donnell woman, she'll get no Donnelling from me, I can assure you. The name is Donnell, and always has been. The woman is crazy, that's what. She has a pug dog she calls Queenie, and it has its meals at the table along with the family, eating off a china plate. I'd be afraid of a judgment if I was her. Thomas says Donnell himself is a sensible, hard-working man, but he hadn't much gumption when he picked out a wife, that's what." Chapter 6. All sorts and conditions of men and woman. A September day on Prince Edward Island hills, a crisp wind blowing up over the sand dunes from the sea, a long red road winding through fields and woods, now looping itself about a corner of thick-set spruces, now threading a plantation of young maples with great feathery sheets of ferns beneath them, now dipping down into a hollow where a brook flashed out of the woods and into them again, now basking in open sunshine between ribbons of golden-rod and smoke-blue asters, a plump brown pony ambling along the road, two girls behind him, full to the lips with the simple, priceless joy of youth and life.
"Oh, this is a day left over from Eden, isn't it, Diana?"
And Anne sighed for sheer happiness.
"The air has magic in it. Look at the purple in the cup of the Harvest Valley, Diana. And oh, do smell the dying fir. It's coming up from that little sunny hollow where Mr. Eben Wright has been cutting fence posts. Blessed is it on such a day to be alive. But to smell dying fir is very heaven. That's 2/3 Wordsworth and 1/3 Anne Shirley. It doesn't seem possible that there should be dying fir in heaven, does it? And yet it doesn't seem to me that heaven would be quite perfect if you couldn't get a whiff of dead fir as you went through its woods. Perhaps we'll have the older deer without the deaf. Yes, I think that will be the way. That delicious aroma must be the souls of the firs. And of course it will be just souls in heaven."
"Trees haven't souls," said practical Diana, "but the smell of dead fir is certainly lovely. I'm going to make a cushion and fill it with fir needles. You'd better make one too, Anne. It's a lovely day, but we have anything but a lovely task before us," sighed Diana. "Why on earth did you offer to canvass this road, Anne? Almost all the cranks in Avonlea live along it, and will probably be treated as if we were begging for ourselves. It's the very worst road of all."
"That is why I chose it. Of course, Gilbert and Fred would have taken this road if we had asked them. But you see, Dinah, I feel myself responsible for the AVIS, since I was the first to suggest it, and it seems to me that I ought to do the most disagreeable things. I'm sorry on your account, but you needn't say a word at the cranky places. I'll do all the talking. Priscilla is going to write a paper for our next improvement meeting, and I expect it will be good, for her aunt is such a clever writer, and no doubt it runs in the family. I shall never forget the thrill it gave me when I found out that Mrs. Charlotte E. Morgan was Priscilla's aunt. It seemed so wonderful that I was a friend of the girl whose aunt wrote Edgewood Days in the Rosebud Garden."
"Where does Mrs. Morgan live?"
"In Toronto, and Priscilla says she is coming to the island for a visit next summer, and if it is possible, Priscilla is going to arrange to have us meet her. That seems almost too good to be true, but it's something pleasant to imagine after you go to bed."
Avonlea Village Improvement Society was an organized fact. Gilbert Blythe was president, Fred Wright vice president, Anne Shirley secretary, and Dinah Barry treasurer. The improvers, as they were promptly christened, were to meet once a fortnight at the homes of the members. It was admitted that they could not expect to effect many improvements so late in the season, but they meant to plan the next summer's campaign, collect and discuss ideas, write and read papers, and, as Anne said, educate the public sentiment generally. There was some disapproval, of course, and, which the improvers felt much more keenly, a good deal of ridicule. Mr. Elisha Wright was reported to have said that a more appropriate name for the organization would be Courting Club. Mrs. Hiram Sloane declared she had heard the improvers meant to plow up all the roadsides and set them out with geraniums. Mr. Levy Bolter warned his neighbors that the improvers would insist that everybody pull down his house and rebuild it after plans approved by the society. Mr. James Spencer sent them word that he wished they would kindly shovel down the church hill. Eben Wright told Anne that he wished the improvers could induce old Josiah Sloane to keep his whiskers trimmed. Mr. Lawrence Bell said he would whitewash his barns if nothing else would please him, but he would not hang lace curtains in the cow stable windows, in spite of, or perhaps human nature being what it is, because of this, the society went gamely to work at the only improvement they could hope to bring about that fall. At the second meeting in the Barry parlor, Oliver Sloane moved that they start a subscription to reshingle and paint the hall. Julia Bell seconded, with an uneasy feeling that she was doing something not exactly ladylike. Gilbert put the motion. It was carried unanimously, and Anne gravely recorded it in her minutes. The next thing was to appoint a committee, and Gertie Pye, determined not to let Julia Bell carry off all the laurels, boldly moved that Miss Jane Andrews be chairman of said committee. This motion being also duly seconded and carried, Jane returned the compliment by appointing Gertie on the committee, along with Gilbert, Anne, Diana, and Fred Wright. The committee chose their routes in private conclave. Anne and Diana were told off for the New Bridge Road, Gilbert and Fred for the White Sands Road, and Jane and Gertie for the Carmody Road. Because, explained Gilbert to Anne as they walked home together through the haunted wood, the Pyes will live along that road and they won't give a cent unless one of themselves canvasses them. The next Saturday, Anne and Diana started out. They drove to the end of the road and canvassed homeward, calling first on the Andrew girls.
"If Catherine is alone, we may get something," said Diana. "But if Eliza is there, we won't."
Eliza was there, very much so, and looked even grimmer than usual. Miss Eliza was one of those people who give you the impression that life is indeed a vale of tears, and that a smile, never to speak of a laugh, is a waste of nervous energy truly reprehensible. The Andrew girls had been girls for 50-odd years and seemed likely to remain girls to the end of their earthly pilgrimage. Catherine, it was said, had not entirely given up on hope, but Eliza, who was born a pessimist, had never had any. They lived in a little brown house, built in a sunny corner scooped out of Mark Andrews' beech woods. Eliza complained that it was terrible hot in summer, but Catherine was wont to say it was lovely and warm in winter. Eliza was sewing patchwork, not because it was needed, but simply as a protest against the frivolous lace Catherine was crocheting. Eliza listened with a frown, and Catherine with a smile, as the girls explained their errand. "If I had money to waste," said Eliza grimly, "I'd burn it up and have the fun of seeing a blaze, maybe, but I wouldn't give it to that hole, not a cent. It's no benefit to the settlement. Just a place for young folks to meet and carry on when they's better be home in their beds." "Oh, Eliza, young folks must have some amusement," protested Catherine.
I don't see the necessity. We didn't get about to holes and places when we were young, Catherine Andrews. This world is getting worse every day.
I think it's getting better, said Catherine firmly.
You think? Miss Eliza's voice expressed the utmost contempt. It doesn't signify what you think, Catherine Andrews. Facts is facts.
Well, I always like to look on the bright side, Eliza.
There isn't any bright side.
Oh, indeed there is,
cried Anne, who couldn't endure such heresy. In silence.
Why, there are ever so many bright sides, Miss Andrews. It's really a beautiful world.
You won't have such a high opinion of it when you've lived as long in it as I have, retorted Miss Eliza sourly. And you won't be so enthusiastic about improving it either. How is your mother, Diana? Dear me, but she has failed of late. She looks terrible run down, and how long is it before Marilla expects to be stone blind, Anne?
The doctor thinks her eyes will not get any worse if she is very careful,
faltered Anne.
Eliza shook her head. Doctors always talk like that just to keep people cheered up. I wouldn't have much hope if I was her. It's best to be prepared for the worst.
But oughtn't we be prepared for the best, too? Pleaded Anne. It's just as likely to happen as the worst.
Not in my experience, and I've 57 years to set against your 16, retorted Eliza. Going, are you? Well, I hope this new society of yours will be able to keep Avonlea from running any further downhill, but I haven't much hope of it.
Anne and Diana got themselves thankfully out and drove away as fast as the fat pony could go. As they rounded the curve below the beech wood, a plump figure came speeding over Mr. Andrews' pasture, waving to them excitedly. It was Catherine Andrews, and she was so out of breath that she could hardly speak, but she thrust a couple of quarters into Anne's hand. "That's my contribution to painting the hall," she gasped. "I'd like to give you $1, but I didn't dare take more from my egg money, for Eliza would find it out if I did. I'm real interested in your society, and I believe you're going to do a lot of good. I'm an optimist. I have to be living with Eliza. I must hurry back before she misses me. She thinks I'm feeding the hens. I hope you'll have good luck canvassing, and don't be cast down over what Eliza said. The world is getting better." It certainly is. Neither Anne nor Diana had ever been there before, and they had only a very slight acquaintance with Mrs. Theodore, who was not given to hospitality. Should they go to the back or front door? While they held a whispered consultation, Mrs. Theodore appeared at the front door with an armful of newspapers. Deliberately, she laid them down one by one on the porch floor and the porch steps, and then down the path to the very feet of her mystified callers. "Will you please wipe your feet carefully on the grass and then walk on these papers?" she said anxiously. "I've just swept the house all over, and I can't have any more dust tracked in. The path's been real muddy since the rain yesterday."
"Don't you dare laugh,"
warned Anne in a whisper as they marched along the newspapers.
"And I implore you, Diana, not to look at me no matter what she says, or I shall not be able to keep a sober face."
The papers extended across the hall and into a prim, fleckless pallor. Anne and Diana sat down gingerly on the nearest chairs and explained their errand. Mrs. White heard them politely, interrupting only twice, once to chase out an adventurous fly, and once to pick up a tiny wisp of grass that had fallen on the carpet from Anne's dress. Anne felt wretchedly guilty, but Mrs. White subscribed $2 and paid the money down, "to prevent us from having to go back for it," Diana said when they got away, and as they drove out of the yard, they saw her busily wielding a broom in the hall. "I've always heard that Mrs. Theodore White was the neatest woman alive, and I'll believe it after this," said Diana, giving way to her suppressed laughter as soon as it was safe.
"I'm glad she has no children," said Anne solemnly. "It would be dreadful beyond words for them if she had."
Anne, tired as she was, made one more effort for the public weal that night, slipping over the fields to interview Mr. Harrison, who was as usual smoking his pipe on the veranda with Ginger beside him. Strictly speaking, he was on the comedy road, but Jane and Gertie, who were not acquainted with him save by doubtful report, had nervously begged Anne to canvass him. Mr. Harrison, however, flatly refused a subscriber cent, and all Anne's wiles were in vain.
"But I thought you approved of our society, Mr. Harrison,"
she mourned. So I do. But my approval doesn't go as deep as my pocket, Anne.
"A few more experiences such as I have had today would make me as much of a pessimist as Miss Eliza Andrews,"
Anne told her reflection in the East Gable mirror at bedtime.